High school state test day. Phone sealed. Classroom rule. No snacks, no water, no leaving. Proctor missed my friend's 504 plan. His blood sugar crashed. School rule versus life.
State testing days have a particular stillness, the kind that tries to pass as order. Our school leaned into it every spring with laminated signs, covered clocks, and a set of rules that sounded reasonable in emails and absolute in practice. Phones sealed in envelopes, desks spaced with a tape measure, hallways treated like libraries where even footsteps were considered suspicious. The proctor's script lived on a clipboard with plastic corners, and deviations were treated like moral failings rather than logistics. On that Tuesday, the script met a body that did not recognize its authority. I sat 2 rows from the windows in room 207, a math classroom that smelled faintly of dry erase and the mint gum teachers pretend not to notice. The desks were the narrow kind that expect elbows to behave. My friend Marcus sat diagonally to my right, close enough that I could see the way his pencil leaned when he started thinking too hard. He had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes that previous winter break, the kind of diagnosis that comes with a whole new vocabulary and a box of supplies that follows you like a shadow. He handled it with the stubborn grace of someone who preferred sports pages to manuals. He also had a 504 plan, a document that promised access to snacks, water, and the nurse without delay. It lived online in a system people swore they consulted. On testing day, paper took priority over portals. Our regular math teacher was out for a training, so a substitute proctor read the instructions exactly as the page required. I did not blame her. People who agree to keep a room full of teenagers silent for 4 hours deserve our respect. She collected phones into the big manila envelopes, sealed them in front of us, and stacked them at the front like contraband. She reminded us that leaving the room would void sections of the test unless escorted by an administrator. She reminded us that snacks were prohibited to protect the integrity of materials. She said all of it in a calm tone, and the room translated calm into compliance. The test booklets arrived in plastic wrap that made a sigh when it tore. Numbers assigned to barcodes aligned with names on rosters. We filled in bubbles for date and ID, and the declaration that we would not engage in behavior that violated the security of the assessment. We were given the familiar talk about fairness and focus. The clocks had paper hats taped over them to keep us from reading time as if time were a cheat. We began. The first section felt like a warm-up jog we had not chosen to run. I moved along grids and word problems and tried to ignore the scratchy hum of the HVAC. 20 minutes in, the room had reached that strange equilibrium where concentration becomes furniture. That was when the edge of my vision started reporting something different from my work. Marcus had stopped turning pages. His shoulders had shifted upward in a way that suggested a body starting to negotiate. His forearm had a sheen that did not belong to room temperature. I did not need a medical chart to know the signs. Low blood sugar announces itself with a blend of sweat, pallor, tremor, and a certain unfocused stare. I saw the checklist without wanting to. I looked for the water bottle he always kept at hand. It was not on the desk. Testing rules had relocated it to his backpack, which sat zipped against the wall with everyone else's belongings. I looked for the small roll of glucose tablets he kept in the outer pocket. It might as well have been a continent away. The proctor stool was positioned next to the phone on the wall, the one that connected to the front office with a button. The button worked on regular days. On testing days, it summoned an administrator who was responsible for too many rooms at once. I tried to arrange my face into nothing. The worst thing you can do in a silent room is broadcast alert. Marcus shifted again. His hand went to his thigh, the universal sign for trying to convince muscles to contribute to a problem they cannot solve. He kept his other hand on the test booklet, as if obedience could barter with biology. I could feel the room's belief in rules like a weighted blanket. The proctor moved along the perimeter with the script that insists on equal attention. She checked hands for errant phones and eyes for wandering, and the floor for the kind of notes that stick to shoes. She did not know him. She had been a stranger yesterday morning and would be a stranger again by Thursday. Expecting her to recognize small changes in color on a boy she had just met would have been unfair. Expecting the script to recognize anything was impossible. There is a moment in every testing session when time stretches and contracts at once. The wall clock had been hooded by paper, but I could feel minutes behaving badly. The noise in my own head got louder than the room. I wanted to raise my hand and could not decide what permission I would be asking for. On state test days, permission lacks a form for blood sugar. Leaving requires a signature, an escort, and a notation that the assessment had been paused under secure conditions. Food requires a separate form or a note in a plan that lives 3 screens deep inside a secure portal the substitute did not have open. Marcus's legs began to jostle in small staccato movements. Not the jitter of nerves, the subtle earthquake of a system asking for sugar. His shoulders dipped and returned, his eyes fixed on the same number for too long. I made myself count his breaths, not because breath was the problem, but because counting slowed my brain enough to select an action. Last week, in a different class, he had explained the 15-15 rule to me without making a big deal of the fact that my ignorance could hurt him. 15 grams of fast-acting carbs and a 15-minute wait to reassess. He had shown me the small tube of glucose gel in his kit, the one that could be squeezed into the cheek if swallowing got complicated. He had joked about orange juice being medicine, not breakfast. I had nodded then, in the way friends do when they are filing useful information without the intention of ever using it. I checked my clear pencil pouch. Testing rules allowed a pencil, eraser, ID, and nothing else. I kept a strip of fruit chews in the seam because I liked knowing I could change a boring moment with sugar. I had forgotten to take them out when the proctor walked the aisles at the start. The strip lay hidden against the cardboard back like contraband smuggling itself. I weighed fear of rules against the way his knee seemed to be broadcasting Morse code. I chose quietly. Shifting as if to adjust the angle of my booklet, I slipped a thumb into the seam and teased the foil loose. The tiny sound felt like a shout. I palmed the strip and breathed evenly until the room forgot my hands. When the proctor's pacing carried her to the windows, I placed the strip at the corner of his desk with the kind of casual motion you use when returning a pencil. He stared through it at first. His hand found it a moment later and hovered. The policy against food in the testing room had been printed in bold on the instruction sheet she had read. Breaking it was a bigger violation than boredom. He knew it. I knew it. But hunger beat policy in biology every time. He pinched off a piece, small enough to be plausible as a fidget, and let it dissolve. The color had drained from his face to a degree that no one else had noticed because no one else had been staring at his face for 2 months, wondering if this day would come. The shaking eased a little, the eyes did not. The room remained silent and suspicious of any action not covered by the script. The proctor, looping back toward our side, spotted the wrapper glinting in the fluorescent light. Her job demanded that all irregularities be neutralized. She reached for it with a motion that belonged to a life where cheating was the only danger. Her hand landed when his hand landed. The wrapper folded and disappeared under his palm. His knuckles were white in a way that would have looked defiant to anyone not paying attention to why a person whites their knuckles.
I braced for a correction that would become a story we would tell later about the day unnecessary rules triumphed. Instead, the proctor caught enough of his pallor to pause. She turned toward the phone without ceremony. Testing rules did not permit her to leave. They did not forbid her from asking for help. She pressed the button and waited with the patience of someone who has sat in too many queues. The office took longer than air permitted. Marcus's head tipped forward. The pencil rolled away and stopped against the edge of the desk. He did not follow it. A sheen of sweat clung to his hairline in a way that would embarrass him later and bothered me more than it should have. His chest rose in a rhythm that suggested the body had shifted power to essential systems and was economizing. I felt my own heart attempt to supply enough blood for both of us. The assistant principal appeared in the doorway carrying a clipboard like a passport. The proctor gestured toward Marcus with a small movement. The clipboard regained its function as decoration. Testing days arrange hierarchies for cheating. Bodies do not cheat. The assistant principal signaled to the hall and an escort materialized. Escort meant nurse. Nurse meant meters and gels and oxygen if it came to that. The plan had always involved teas and staff and a hallway. The hallway felt like an ocean. When they moved him up from the chair, his legs hesitated. Low blood sugar improvises. It steals decisiveness and then returns it on a delay. The escort guided him with the lightest touch, the way you steer someone who insists on dignity. He left the test booklet open to a page that would now be measured and sealed according to procedures. It felt obscene to care about procedures. It also felt necessary to feel that way in a building that teaches procedures as culture. The door swallowed them. The room remade its silence around the absence. The proctor returned to her stool and the phone. She wrote something on a form. She wrote something else on a different form. Forms are the only way schools admit that time has misbehaved. I stared at the bubble sheet and could not make my pencil follow commands for several minutes. The test had not changed. The room had. I knew that the nurse was 3 doors down from the office with a drawer that held a meter and gel and a printout of his most recent ranges. I knew that she would use the meter to coax the truth out of his blood and then use the truth to negotiate with the crisis. I knew that she would call his mother from a landline that would ring in a pocket full of worry. I knew these things because our school has small pockets of competence that operate regardless of the policy above them. Time decided to behave again. The HVAC clicked its little cycle. The proctor wrote room numbers on envelopes like a person doing arithmetic for a living. I made my pencil move across bubbles in the bland pattern of compliance. The section ended. Break arrived with its stingy rules about staying seated and resting eyes and not discussing items, as if discussing items were the temptation in the room. The assistant principal returned with a note that the student in question was receiving support and would resume testing with appropriate accommodations if applicable. The sentence pointed to a world where correct paperwork could retroactively make today kinder. I learned later in the neutral light of the nurse's office what had happened after the door. His meter had offered a number that begins with a 5 and should have begun with a 1. He had been handed a tube of gel that tasted like fruit and medicine at once. The nurse had spoken in steady counts while his system drank sugar. 15 minutes had been measured by a watch strap and a wall clock. The number had climbed like a person learning a staircase for the first time after an injury. Water had been offered and then taken. The proctor had been informed that additional time would be granted. The assistant principal had written a note with the word accommodation and the date, as if that word could erase the sequence of molecules that had made the morning dangerous.
But all of that came later. In the moment, what I had was a strip of fruit chews dissolving into nothing under a palm. A room that had conflated silence with safety, and a friend whose biology did not care about laminated scripts. I also had a small, private rule that I would not write on any school form. If I ever saw his color shift again while paper claimed priority, I would choose the color. No drama, no heroics, just a pencil pouch that contained more than pencils and a willingness to accept whatever consequence followed. Testing ended at noon, because tests believe in halves. Phones were returned with the ceremony of amnesty. The class filed out solemn and relieved. I found him in the nurse's office, sitting in the kind of plastic chair that pretends to be comfortable. His mother had arrived with a face that combined competence and exhaustion. The nurse moved with the humility of someone whose victories are measured in small increments. Marcus gave me a look that said the morning had been a lot, and that he would prefer if I did not turn it into a story about us. I did not. I filed it under a different category: rules that work on paper and bodies that do not. The day's last bell sounded ordinary.
The corridor filled with the dense noise of teenagers becoming loud again. The sun caught the metal of lockers and made the building look friendlier than it had at 8 a.m. I kept moving because moving sometimes keeps feelings from congealing. On the way out, a custodian peeled a laminated sign off a door and replaced it with the same sign in a newer font. The change meant nothing. The change meant everything. A school had done a small, bureaucratic thing. A friend had taken a large biological breath. The relationship between those facts would become the rest of the story. The day after the test felt ordinary, in the way hallways pretend to be lakes after a storm. The bell schedule resumed its usual authority. Teachers reclaimed their rooms from the quiet. The phone in room 207 sat on its hook, gleaming with the dignity of a device that had not been asked to do anything messy. The proctor had moved on to another building or another assignment. Our regular teacher returned with a stack of graded quizzes and the calm of someone who trusts routine. Nothing in the room announced that a number on a meter had been far too low 24 hours earlier. Marcus reappeared with the same backpack and a different pace. He carried himself with that careful economy that people use when they have recently negotiated with their own biology. He found me at the start of second period with the small nod that replaces a long story among friends. The nurse had adjusted ratios. His mother had rechecked the supplies, and the plan had been declared sound, which is the medical word people use when they mean survivable. The school's portal contained a 504 plan written in neutral language about access to water, snacks, and quick nurse trips. On testing day, the plan had met a substitute, a script, and an envelope for phones. The interaction had not favored blood sugar. By lunch, a brief announcement had slipped into faculty inboxes. It thanked staff for professionalism during state assessment, reminded everyone to preserve test security, and urged fidelity to procedures. A second paragraph acknowledged that medical needs may arise, and directed teachers to contact the office if assistance was required. The verbs favored caution. The nouns favored the integrity of materials. The message avoided the kind of sentence that would admit how close a body had come to failing. That is not a criticism. Schools speak in the register of liability because that is the language that keeps lights on. Students learn to translate.
In the nurse's office, a more practical language prevailed. The drawer with meters and gel stayed unceremoniously stocked. The counter gained a small stack of orange cards that, when slid under a door, would signal medical urgency even during a silence rule. A handwritten list appeared near the phone with extensions for the office, the assistant principal, and the resource officer, plus a note about calling emergency services if minutes misbehaved. None of this made it into a memo. It lived in the space where adults who know the shape of danger refuse to wait for a committee. Word traveled through the student body with the usual distortions. In one version, a kid had tried to cheat by eating during the test and gotten lightheaded from guilt. In another, the substitute had panicked and made a scene, which had forced paramedics to show up and delay the entire schedule. The most convincing rumor put the emphasis where reality had put it. A rule had collided with a condition, and the condition had won only because other rules had temporarily bent. No one used hero language. No one used Vulin language either. That felt accurate. Guidance posted a reminder about counseling availability for anyone feeling unsettled by recent events. The phrase recent events did its heavy work again, smoothing edges that did not want to be smoothed. A notice for students with medical plans encouraged a check-in with the nurse to confirm accommodations for the remainder of testing season. The same notice directed families to a link where forms could be uploaded in case any doctor's notes had changed. Forms had become our new weather. In third period English, time did a small trick on me. The class read a passage about a character making a choice between rules and mercy. The discussion hovered over metaphors. My brain was not in the metaphors. It was back at a desk where a wrapper had flashed under fluorescent light, and a hand had landed on it at the same moment as someone else's. It was at a wall phone that had summoned an administrator on a schedule that did not belong to blood. It was inside a gel tube that had tasted like medicine and fruit and the relief that follows arithmetic returning to a body. After school, our coach ran a shorter practice and pretended not to. Marcus stretched without joking. The water breaks grew more frequent without comment. A few teammates watched him with the complicated attention reserved for people who insist on normal after an abnormal day. The coach sent him to the nurse for a quick check before he let him start sprints. No speech accompanied the gesture. The whistle did the only talking the afternoon required. At home that night, my mother cooked pasta that refused to overperform and listened while I explained the 15-15 rule as if she had never cooked a meal that required ratios. She nodded through the definitions and then asked whether the school had been kind. I said the nurse had been kind, the proctor had been fair, the administrator had been brisk, and the policy had been a wall with a door that took too long to find the key. She accepted the categories without asking me to supply blame. We do not have space for blame on Tuesdays. Blame takes hours. Dinner takes 20 minutes. 2 days later, a 504 team meeting assembled in the small conference room near the front office. It included the counselor, the nurse, Marcus's mother, our math teacher, and a person from district testing who wore a lanyard heavy with proof of access. The meeting lived in precise language. Allowable snacks, labeled water bottles, seat location, nurse access, proctor briefing before tests, substitute folder contents, and a line about discretion during emergencies. I did not attend because students and friends do not get to vote on policy. Later, Marcus reported the outcome without dramatics. The plan would be printed for testing days so that anyone subbing would not have to open a portal. A small card would ride in his desk on test mornings, initialed by the nurse. Water would be permitted under the desk in a clear bottle that had been pre-cleared. A strip of glucose tablets would be allowed in his pencil pouch, visible to proctors but exempt from snacks forbidden rules. Each sentence sounded as if an adult had finally drawn a square around the idea that sugar is not a cheat code, it is fuel.
That same week, the district posted a one-page guidance document for proctors. It maintained the tone of guardianship over integrity and also included a box about health plans. The box advised familiarity with accommodations, encouraged proactive check-ins with the nurse, and suggested a method for noting medical pauses without compromising materials. Buried at the bottom was a sentence that admitted a truth everyone in the nurse's office already knew. When seconds matter, call for help by any available channel. The sentence did not bless phones outright. It left the door unlocked and walked away. That was enough. Real life continued around the new precautions. A math quiz returned with red marks that felt normal. Cafeteria pizza tasted like cardboard and salt, which is its job. The bus smelled like a dozen separate stories beginning at once. A custodian replaced a burned-out bulb near the stairwell where the morning sun never visits. Marcus stopped looking like a person who had recently made his body a bargaining table. The problem with relief is that it teaches you to expect relief. The problem with schools is that they schedule the next test anyway. The next assessment on the calendar was English, a reading-heavy session in a different wing of the building. The testing coordinator ran a brief training for proctors that added 10 minutes to everyone's week. The training reminded them about scripts, timing, and documentation. It also described a short path for communicating with the office about medical issues without abandoning a room. A few veterans rolled their eyes at the idea that common sense required a slideshow. A few newer teachers wrote down every bullet point as if their job depended on it. Both reactions were honest. Marcus and I developed a small routine that no one else needed to notice. On testing mornings, he stopped by the nurse's office to pick up a signed card and to confirm supplies. I stood outside the door to avoid turning the scene into a scene. If the card took longer than usual, I walked him to the room anyway and sat in my own seat without making a ceremony out of it. I kept a transparent roll of fruit chews in my pencil pouch, not because the plan required my help, but because plans need backups, and backups need redundancy. The pouch sat on my desk like any other pouch, visible and boring. The English test began under rules that now recognized him without making an announcement. The proctor, our regular English teacher, had read the accommodations before she read the script. She placed the water under his desk with the matter-of-fact grace that students appreciate more than inspiration. The test settled into its steady rhythm of passages and inference. The room achieved that thick focus that makes each cough sound like a message. Nothing dramatic occurred. He finished on time. He handed in a booklet that would be shuffled into stacks and shipped off to a warehouse. The success was unphotogenic. The success mattered. Afterward, a line of students formed at the nurse's office for unrelated reasons: a headache, a scraped knuckle, a loose bracket on braces. The nurse moved through them with the patience of someone who knows that a body's request is a body's request and should be honored without commentary. Marcus sat in a chair and read a box score while she logged his card into a binder that would be stacked and archived later. The process did not make headlines. The process made sense. The assistant principal stopped by the nurse's office and asked for a summary that could be used in a brief to the superintendent. The nurse provided a timeline that respected privacy and emphasized the small changes that had produced a different outcome: a printed plan, a pre-briefed proctor, a water bottle that did not have to sneak past the rules, a drawer stocked, and a sentence in a guidance document that gave adults cover to move faster. The brief migrated up the chain with the muted pride that accompanies functional systems. Nobody asked for credit, everybody accepted responsibility. That is the only combination that spreads. Not every room adopted the spirit of the changes. In one class, a teacher returned the printed 504 plan to Marcus with the kind of firmness that signals discomfort with exceptions. She preferred to keep rules flat. He reacted with the kind of maturity that threatens people who love flat rules. He went back to the nurse and returned with the same plan and a small note from the counselor that the teacher filed without comment. The next day, the water stayed under the desk. No one apologized. That is how culture shifts, quietly after resistance runs out of new reasons.
The phone policy did not change. Envelopes still swallowed devices at the start of each test. Proctors still sealed them with practiced ceremony. Everyone still touched their pockets after the envelopes were collected, as if checking for a phantom limb. I kept my device in the pouch with my ID and surrendered it along with everyone else when required. The difference now was not in the rule, but in the posture of the adults who enforced it. The office button was tested in the morning. The intercom line was monitored more closely. The assistant principal kept a radio on a belt that had been an accessory a week earlier and became equipment now. None of this guaranteed anything. All of it nudged odds. Outside of school, the story polymerized into something larger. A parent group shared a resource sheet about chronic conditions and school policies. The sheet included sample language for 504 plans that had already saved someone else's morning somewhere else. A local pediatric clinic posted a reminder about the signs of hypoglycemia, formatted for teachers who do not have time to become endocrinologists between second and third period. An advocacy organization updated a guide about navigating statewide tests with accommodations, emphasizing that security and safety can coexist when adults plan instead of posture. The parts of the world that speak in bullet points had decided to help. I noticed the ways my own habits shifted. I sat closer to doors when I could, not to flee, but to open. I learned the names of 2 hall monitors I had never needed to talk to. I read the state code sections linked in the parent emails, not because I planned to quote them, but because they calmed me. I kept a tiny note card in my backpack with 3 phone extensions and a line that reminded me to use any channel if seconds went feral. I stopped treating preparation like paranoia. Marcus returned to being a student who complained about cafeteria oranges and pop quizzes. He let people forget the episode unless they needed the story for their own courage. He kept the gel in his bag and the tablets in his pouch, and the meter at the top of the drawer. He resumed the parts of teenage life that do not appear in medical literature: teasing a friend about shoes, losing to a ridiculous shot in pickup, pretending a grade did not matter before admitting it did. The incident receded, as incidents should. The lesson did not. Spring brought a school board meeting with a short agenda and a long public comment period. Parents and staff used their 3 minutes to stitch together a picture of the month. The district health coordinator summarized the adjustments with the modesty of a person who prefers downstream outcomes to upstream applause. The superintendent thanked everyone without turning gratitude into a shield. The vote was unanimous, which is another way of saying that reality had left the room without enemies to propose. Back in classrooms, students continued to be loud at the right times and quiet at the wrong ones. Tests continued to arrive in plastic wrap that sighed when it tore.
Teachers continued to collect envelopes with the practiced hands of people doing a job that many outsiders believe is simple. And somewhere inside the administrative layers that make schools function, a small stack of printed 504 plans began to ride on top of test rosters instead of behind them. That reordering changed nothing about the outer appearance of discipline. It changed everything about the survival of a few bodies on specific mornings. The month ended without ceremony. On the last Friday of testing season, someone in the office put away the envelope box and wrote a small note to order more before next spring. The nurse inventoried supplies without narrating victory. The proctors submitted their security affidavits and recycled the scripts. The principal sent a brief message thanking everyone for patience and professionalism. It was the same message schools always send at the end of hard stretches. It did not name the morning when a wrapper flashed under fluorescent light and a hand found a strip of sugar with the kind of relief that changes a year. The message didn't need to name it. The people who needed to remember already did. What remained for me were two private commitments. The first was to keep acting like an adult when adults are busy being systems. The second was to keep telling the story without turning it into a morality play. A policy did not grow teeth and bite my friend. People built a process that left a gap, and other people filled it, and then the gap was made smaller with the dull tools of forms, training, and better sentences. That is not a thrilling arc. It is the one most of us rely on to stay okay. The next chapter did not hold a crisis. It held a choice about whether the small improvements would stick when attention wandered. Testing season ends, summer arrives, complacency is patient. Systems forget after they survive. People forget because surviving makes forgetting feel like a reward. The question waiting for us after the relief was simple and unglamorous. Would the habit of making space for a bottle and a strip of tablets remain after the glow of a near miss faded? The answer would take another ordinary day to reveal.
Spring turned into summer, and then back into hallways without ceremony. Posters for clubs reappeared, the same tape marks on the floors reappeared, and attention drifted the way attention does when a crisis becomes a story and the story becomes background. The printed 504 plans still rode on top of rosters, the orange medical cards still lived in nurse drawers, and the guidance slide about seconds still sat in proctor folders. None of that guaranteed memory. Systems forget politely. The first test of the new year arrived in October with a different flavor. A district benchmark rather than a state assessment. People take benchmarks less seriously, which is to say, they take the rules less seriously while still performing the ritual. Our English teacher was at a training, so a substitute stepped in with the same clipboard posture as the last one. The envelope for phones went around the room and swallowed devices with the usual amnesty tone. Water bottles sat under desks only for students whose plans had already been briefed. Marcus carried his card and his clear pouch with tablets. The proctor glanced at the card, nodded with the detached focus of someone managing 25 moving parts, and began the script. Half an hour in, a small error revealed how memory erodes. The substitute had not tested the intercom button before starting. She discovered the lapse after noticing a student at the back holding a tissue to a nose that would not stop bleeding. She pressed the button and heard silence that was too familiar to be surprising. The office line on the wall phone worked only after a second attempt. The nurse arrived with gauze and the kind of encouragement that travels without sound. The incident ended as a nuisance, not a crisis, and the class returned to passages and multiple choice. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became a reminder that a working channel is not a guarantee, it is a habit. Marcus felt fine that day. He had visited the nurse before the bell for the ritual check, sat near the door by design, and returned his finished booklet on time. His mother texted later that evening with the kind of gratitude that fits inside a single sentence. The day did not need heroics. It needed a small maintenance ticket and a proctor who would add a test to the next morning's routine. A different room provided the next lesson. In the library, a makeup session ran for students who had been absent during the first round.
The librarian proctored with the precision of someone who trusts procedure, which is a reasonable way to run a quiet room. One of the test takers had a peanut allergy listed in a plan that had been printed, initialed, and placed on the desk beside the roster. No one eats during tests, so the plan felt theoretical. At the 40-minute mark, the student's throat started to itch. The source was not a snack. It was a hand that had touched a surface touched earlier by the wrong food. The student squeezed a warning into the air by posture alone. The librarian, who had attended the same training as everyone else, recognized posture better than symptoms. The orange card slid under the door, the office button worked on the first press, the nurse arrived with epinephrine and calm. The room barely rippled, no alarm sounded. The student stabilized and left with the nurse for observation. The class continued. Later, the librarian logged the incident as a line item rather than an anecdote. That is how culture shifts in buildings that prefer not to call attention to themselves. Complacency is patient. It tried again at the end of the month, during a fire alarm that turned into a hold in place. A wing had a malfunctioning panel that insisted on screaming. Administration converted the drill into a managed pause until facilities could declare the hallway safe. The pause arrived in the middle of a math test in a room with a teacher who did not love exceptions. He had laminated notes about integrity near the whiteboard and posted a tally of lost minutes every time a phone vibrated during a lesson. He had read Marcus's plan and signed the acknowledgement. He also believed in flat rules as a moral practice. The hold in place meant doors stayed shut, classes stayed in seats, and phone lines filled with the sound of adults asking the same question in different tones. Marcus checked his numbers under the desk, found them inside a range that did not require intervention, and kept working. The teacher paced in a way that suggested he wished the world would adopt his rhythms. 10 minutes passed, 15 passed. The teacher announced a time extension in the neutral way that contains annoyance. No one objected. The hold lifted, the hallway reset, and the test ended without incident. It was almost boring. The boredom felt expensive.
The nurse kept collecting small improvements. The intercom test schedule moved from tape under the button to a printed checklist near the door. The orange cards multiplied, one per room rather than one per hallway. The front office added a whiteboard with room numbers and a magnet that staff slid to indicate that a proctor had been briefed that morning. The changes did not look like reform. They looked like housekeeping. Housekeeping is how schools survive. At home, the story settled into the kinds of habits that do not make announcements. Marcus kept glucose tabs in a clear pouch that lived in the pencil tray, water under the desk, and a meter at the top of the drawer. He visited the nurse on test mornings without creating a procession. He started teasing me again about my track splits, which meant his body had stopped enforcing its own caution tape. I kept a spare straw of chews in my backpack, more for my nerves than his numbers. A few teachers clung to unease. Exceptions make some people feel singled out in rooms where fairness is currency. The counselor noticed and offered a short lunchtime session about accommodations framed as equity rather than special treatment. A social studies teacher explained that equal is not the same as identical. The science teacher described glucose as fuel rather than privilege. The nurse reminded everyone that seconds are not a political category. A few teachers relaxed. The rest stopped arguing out loud. That was enough. The board revisited policy language in November. The revision that had lived as guidance during the spring became a permanent section rather than a memo. The language kept its cautious tone while admitting that students with documented needs may self-carry specific rescue medications, including glucose sources, during all school activities except in environments where the risk of misuse exceeds the risk of delay, which is bureaucratic for almost always. The lockdown protocol kept its bones, but adopted the orange card formally. The test proctoring manual added a box that used the word seconds in a sentence that would have made last year's lawyers nervous. No one resigned, no one held a press conference. The board voted and went home. Winter brought finals and dark afternoons. Marcus missed a morning with the flu that did not care about schedules, then returned with the irritated patience of a person who hates falling behind more than he hates being lectured about hydration.
He completed makeups in a quiet room with a proctor who had already read the card. The envelope for phones sat at the front, a familiar prop. He finished a section, checked in with the nurse by habit, and met me in the hallway to complain about the essay prompt without dramatizing the morning. We ate pretzels in the commons and pretended that adolescence and policy could coexist without friction. For an hour, they did. The last test of that quarter happened in a room with a first-year teacher who approached procedures like a checklist for survival. She over-prepared in all the right ways. Phone tested, intercom tested, roster aligned with printed plans, water positions marked with sticky notes, nurse briefed, assistant principal updated. The exam unfolded without any need for the preparation. When she returned the booklets to the office, she told the secretary that nothing had happened. The secretary congratulated her with the dry humor of people who live on the other side of the desk. Nothing is a good day. By the time snow made the stairs treacherous, the near miss from the previous spring had moved from acid in my chest to a single sentence I carried for future use. Paper is a tool. Bodies are the plan. The sentence did not argue with rules. It wrapped them in a purpose they could live with. The year would test whether that sentence could outlast the season.
Late winter delivered the kind of morning that reveals whether routines have become culture. The building hosted a state-mandated writing assessment. The coordinator had spent a week pre-briefing, the nurse had printed and signed plans, and the assistant principal had built a spreadsheet that grouped rooms by proximity to the office in case an escort became necessary. The librarian had prepped the makeup space. The intercom test had been run the previous afternoon and again at dawn. The orange cards sat in door pockets that had once held old hall pass slips. Every prop was in place. The question was whether the people were ready without needing to pretend they were heroes. Marcus and I arrived early by accident. A bus had run ahead of schedule, and the building had not adjusted yet. He checked in with the nurse as always, tucked the signed card into his pencil tray, and walked to his room with a posture that signaled ordinary. I walked to mine and gave up my phone to the envelope with minimal complaint. The proctor reminded us of timing checkpoints, the rules about silence, and the method for signaling questions that did not involve questions. The room breathed in and out together and then settled. Halfway through the session, a phenomenon older than policy intervened. The weather shifted and brought a pressure change that made sinuses and heads register nuisance. In the next room over, a student prone to migraines began the slide into aura and nausea. The plan for that student did not require anything dramatic, just a dimmed light, a pause, and a short, escorted trip to the nurse for meds that had already been documented. The proctor there used the intercom. It worked on the first press. The office responded with the tone of people distributing resources rather than permission. An escort arrived, the student left, the class continued. No names traveled beyond the room. Later, the nurse logged the accommodations and returned the student to finish with a time extension. The rhythm matched the slide deck, because the slide deck had been written by people who had lived the rhythm. Our room had its own quieter test. Marcus felt the nudge of a low approaching. Not a plunge, just the ordinary drift that a meter translates into a number and a body translates into a suggestion. He took one tablet from the clear pouch with the kind of practiced discretion that turns care into muscle memory. The proctor, already briefed, observed with the same discretion and marked the time in the margin of a roster where no one else would ever look. Nothing else happened. He kept writing. The water remained under the desk like any other object. I finished my own response and realized I had not glanced at him in 10 minutes because I no longer needed vigilance to hold me upright. A different kind of challenge arrived 15 minutes later. The intercom crackled with a hold in place for a wing far from ours. The alert cut across rooms in the terse language that means keep everyone where they are while an adult solves a problem elsewhere. This is the moment when rules and bodies often collide. They did not collide this time. Proctors noted the time, room stayed put, the front office kept an eye on the channels, and the hold lifted before anyone's patience stretched thin. The test clock extended by exactly the number of minutes lost. No one argued. The spreadsheet in the office adjusted figures silently. The day returned to what it had been doing. Boredom reclaimed its territory. After the session, the assistant principal did a small round with a notepad to collect any friction points. The list contained nothing dramatic. One intercom had lagged for a second before waking. A pencil sharpener had made too much noise and would be taped closed next time. A proctor wanted a clearer example in the script about how to log a medical pause without over-explaining. The nurse requested another stack of cards for a cluster of rooms near the gym. The secretary added envelopes to a reorder list. The coordinator updated the proctor folder checklist to include an early morning intercom tap. None of it made a headline. All of it meant the next time would be easier. The board did not revisit policy again that spring. There was no need. The superintendent's Friday note praised staff for a smooth testing season and congratulated students for stamina. The note did not name the invisible scaffolding behind smooth and stamina. It did not need to. The people who built it were already moving to the next unglamorous task. That is the truest version of credit institutions can offer.
In the quieter lanes of school life, the outcomes showed up in small mercies. Teachers stopped making jokes about water bottles unless the jokes were kind. Hall monitors learned which faces to wave through without turning a routine into a parade. Proctors began to spend an extra minute scanning rosters for plans before they scanned barcodes for tests. Students began to know which rooms felt safer without needing to say why. The embarrassment around accommodations lost its theatrical edge. Exceptions stopped looking like loopholes and started looking like literacy. Marcus and I marked the anniversary of the near miss without marking it. We split a bagel before class and argued about whether a late-night game had been worth the yawns. He carried the meter without dramatics. I carried the choose without superstition. We both carried the sentence that had become the point. Paper is a tool. Bodies are the plan. Neither of us needed to recite it anymore. The building had learned to act like it was true. On the last day of testing, the librarian proctored a small room of makeups again. She told the secretary afterward that nothing had happened. The secretary responded with the dry humor she used for good news. Nothing is a good day. The nurse finished an inventory and wrote a note to herself to restock before the next season so that no one would have to scramble after a quiet summer of forgetting. The assistant principal closed the spreadsheet and sent a final message to proctors with a thank you that sounded like a sigh turning into a nod. The principal walked the halls without a radio glued to his hand and pretended not to notice how many tiny, boring things had just gone right. I thought about telling the story to a cousin who still thinks schools are either disasters or miracles. I decided against it. The appeal of disasters and miracles is that they fit in one breath. The reality we lived through needed several. A friend almost lost a morning because a rule outranked a body. A nurse refused to let that be the whole story. Teachers bent policy without breaking trust. Administrators rewrote slides in the most careful font they could find. Parents added clauses to forms that would live in binders long after the rest of us graduated. The building learned a better set of habits. We all went back to being teenagers with homework. The question that started this never changed. What school rule almost killed my friend? The answer never needed a drum roll. The rule that said test security disallows snacks, water, and leaving without ceremony came pointlessly close. The fix was not a revolution. It was a stack of boring, durable adjustments. A printed plan on top of rosters, a pouch with tablets treated like a pencil, an orange card under a door, a working intercom, a sentence in a manual that reminded adults that seconds count even when scripts are sacred. On the last afternoon of the year, we sat on the bleachers watching the field crew paint lines for a summer camp that would borrow our grass.
Marcus leaned back and let the sun do its work. He said, without turning it into drama, that he barely remembered the panic now. He remembered the orange gel and the nurse's calm rhythm more. I said, without turning it into a sermon, that I barely remembered the test. I remembered the way the room had felt when the wrapper flashed and the decision became obvious. He laughed and said it figured that I would memorialize stationery. I told him it figured that he would turn biology into a joke to make me stop lecturing. We let the conversation settle into ordinary. A year earlier, we had been lucky. This year, we had been prepared. Luck is not a plan. Preparation is not a headline. Both can keep a friend breathing long enough to complain about an essay prompt, and that is a form of success I will take every time.